Alright, baby, let's get going. My name is Valentin, and today we'll be talking about our latest work on volumetric maps, specifically on bijective simplicial maps. So, let's say you have a mesh, and you want to map this mesh to some prescribed boundary in a way that the map is bijective, i.e., that there is no degenerate or inverted elements in either domain. In 2D, this problem is well known, well established, and has some really nice solution with theoretical guarantees. But in 3D, with tetrahedral meshes, this remains an open problem. I should also mention that some of the applications include parametrization, deformation, stuff like that. So if you look at the state of the art, there is this foliation paper which does have some theoretical guarantees, but unfortunately only has limited boundary condition prescribing. So depending on your target domain, you might not be able to prescribe the exact positions for boundary vertices. And also the other issue is that this usually requires some extreme mesh refinement. On the other hand, you have some optimization-based techniques, such as fold-over-free maps in total lifted content, which roughly works with some input mesh that you map to some target domain, and some given initialization that may or may not contain degenerate or inverted elements. And then the point is to minimize some objective function to try to get rid of those degenerate and inverted elements. So one of the advantages here is that it works with any boundary constraints and any topology, right? It could be a ball topology or torus or whatever. Unfortunately, for a given mesh, so a fixed mesh, the map might not actually exist. And also there is no guarantees, and there are no guarantees to find this map with those methods. And that's where we come in. That's where we want to make progress. And so we introduce our new method called shrink and expand, which is whose primary goal is robustness. Our main focus is just to guarantee or to obtain a map. So we designed a constructive method inspired from the 2D progressive embeddings, and I'll show you how it works. So let me just first color some edges to follow what's happening here. Let's say we have this original mesh and we map it to some prescribed boundaries and some initial map for in the interior. From now on, I will show the prescribed boundary in green as reference. Also, please note that I will only show now the target domain mesh rather than the whole map for simplicity. So the first step of our method is to shrink some edges to get rid of those flipped elements. And note that here I talk about shrinkage and not collapse, because the collapse is a topological operation, right? You change the topology of the mesh, its connectivity, but with the shrinks, you don't. You only change the geometry and take an edge and set its length to 0, meaning that its two end vertices are now coincident. And we repeat this shrinkage process until you no longer have any flipped elements, only degenerate ones. Then the second step is to pull those vertices that are coincident apart from each other in a way that monotonically decreases the number of degenerate elements. Also without ever creating any new flipped elements, right? So we after the shrinkage part, we no longer have any flipped elements, and we will we will keep it at 0 throughout the process. The only thing we do is to monotonically decrease the number of degenerate elements. So looking a bit more into the first part about shrinkage, shrinking the mesh. Let's say we again have some bad initial map and we want to shrink this yellow edge. We see that by doing so, we actually increase the number of flipped elements. And so this should give you some hints at the fact that finding a minimal sequence of edges to shrink to get rid of all the inverted tetrahedra is quite difficult and is a combinatorial problem in a sense. Even finding a good heuristic is also very difficult. So for this reason, what we do is that we just shrink all interior elements to a single single point. And this means that our target boundary should be star-shaped. Right? because if it isn't, then no matter where we put our set of coincident vertices, we will always have inverted elements. Now if we look a bit into the second step, the expansion, so let's say we have a set of coincident vertices. Now I will just slightly show them apart for visualization, but keep in mind that all of those pink vertices are actually coincident. If we pick one vertex we want to expand, we can then define its expansion cone roughly as the set of incident simplices that are non-degenerate. So if we look at this expansion key here in orange, we see that it's not a ball topology, and thus that its kernel is empty. And so if we move this vertex around, we'll always create some inverted elements. So instead what we do is that we pick a vertex whose expansion cone is ball topology, as this one. In that case, we can move the vertex within the kernel of its expansion cone and decrease the number of degenerate elements. We can repeat this process a few times, right, and have more elements that are now non-degenerate. And we see that the initial vertex that we had, if we look at its expansion cone, we see that now it is ball topology and its kernel is non-empty, and we can also expand it within this kernel. So in 2D, this ball topology condition is enough, but in 3D, things are not so simple. I will shortly show you why. So now let's take an actual 3D example, right? Because so far we only took 2D examples for simplicity because it's enough to understand what's happening, but keep in mind that our whole method is 3D. So now if we have some target 3D mesh, we can pick some vertex to expand, and here it's expansion cone highlighted in orange. If we look at this expansion cone, we see that as it is star-shaped, right? Its kernel is non-empty and all is well. But if the geometry was slightly different like this, then its kernel is non-empty and we cannot expand this vertex, even if this expansion cone is ball topology. So in that case, what we do is that we select some edges that are incident to the green vertex that we want to expand and split those. So here you should note that splits are the only topological modifications we make to the mesh throughout the process, right? There's only refinement necessary for our method to work. So now that we have split those edges, what we do is that we discretely bend them in a way that changes the shape of the expansion cone. And now you'll see that some of those tetrahedra are no longer incident to the green vertex, meaning that they are no longer part of the expansion cone. And if we go back to our previous point of view, we see that the expansion cone clearly now is star-shaped. Of course, this whole process of what we call star shapification is more complicated, has many more steps, but it should kind of give you some idea of what's happening for this part. Now the next question is, how do we pick vertices to expand? Because so far we only considered single vertices, right? And the expansion cone, but we could actually also pick 2 or 3 or more vertices to expand. So in addition to the ball topology, the expansion cone being ball topology, we also have to add now that the set of vertices we want to expand is simply connected. So again, this is a combinatorial problem, which can be difficult to find a solution. And there's also the possibility that no such subset of vertices exists, right? That no matter the combination of vertices, the expansion cone is never ball topology, is never ball topology. And this step is the only one where a method could actually fail. So to summarize, we start with some initial map that has some flipped elements that we shrink, right? We shrink the whole interior to a single point, and then the map is only partially degenerate but contains no flipped elements. Then we try to find some vertices to expand, and again here it's the only point where our method could fail. If we cannot find such expandable vertex sets, our method fails. Once we have those vertices, if we have those vertices to expand, we might need to star shapify their expansion cone. And once this cone is star shapified, or was already star shaped, we can expand those vertices. And since this expansion operation only monotonically decreases the number of degenerate elements, we just have to check whether or not we still have any degenerate elements. If we do, well, we simply repeat this process over until we no longer have any degenerate elements and the map is bijective. So 3 of those steps can be implemented in different ways, right? For instance, for shrinking, I explained that we shrink the whole interior, right, to avoid trying to find a better sequence and so on. But we could put more effort into trying to find the best sequence possible. Same for finding expandable vertex sets or star-shapifying the cones. Those 3 parts could be implemented in different ways. And that's why our method is a framework rather than a single algorithm. So to evaluate the robustness of our method and its current implementation, we took 3000 ball topology meshes from the TET-WILD dataset that we mapped to 4 different boundary conditions, specifically something that's shaped like a tetrahedron, another one shaped like a tetrahedron, except here we map one of the faces from the original domain mesh to a single face of the tetrahedron in the target domain. That means that we have a stiffer problem around this face. We have a stiffer problem, and we call this the stiff tetrahedron. We also have a ball-shaped, a sphere-shaped boundary, and finally a random star-shaped, obtained by taking some, for instance, the ball-shaped boundary and randomizing the norm of the positions on the boundary. So this makes for 12,000 cases in total. Since a lot of cases, we also set a 12 hours time limit per case. And with this setup, we obtain a bijective map for 77% of the dataset, meaning that our method times out for 33% of the dataset. If we compare that to state-of-the-art method, namely the 2 that I mentioned earlier, total lifted content and full over free maps, we get a better success rate of obtaining bijective maps. Also a lower rate of timeouts, right? And notably we get 0 maps that are non-bijective. That means that we either get a bijective map or timeout. And also that means that our only possibility for failing, right, that we don't find any set of vertices to expand, is actually never experienced. If we look a bit at how those cases are distributed, we have those 12,000 cases approximately. We see that about 6,000 of them are mapped by are successfully mapped in bijective way by our method, while for the other methods it's fewer cases. And notably we have about 2,000 cases for which none of the 3 methods succeed in getting a bijective map. We also have other comparisons, for instance on runtime and distortion with those methods in the paper. So please have a look if you're interested. So to conclude, we have designed this constructive process for 3D bijective tetrahedral maps that has shown to have better robustness than the state-of-the-art methods. I think the most important aspect of it is that it's a framework that is modular, right? As we discussed, there are multiple parts that can be implemented in different ways, meaning that we have many options to improve this framework. And then the code and dataset are available online at this QR code. Thank you very much for your attention.